So Suunto did something unexpected with their newest flagship sports watch. They decided to go a completely different direction by switching from the tried and true memory pixel display they had in the original vertical to an AMOLED display on this vertical too. And this was definitely a gamble considering the original vertical is one of the best choices for an ultra endurance athlete or for any of you out there who only want to charge your watch like once a month. So was switching to AMOLED the right move for the vertical too? And more importantly, is this still the right choice when it comes to an ultra endurance outdoor focused sports watch? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. So I've been wearing the Vertical 2 since it first came out a few months ago, and I put in over 1,500 miles and almost 100,000 feet of climbing on this thing. So this is truly a long-term review here. Like, I've been wearing this daily, not only for training, but also for daily wear, including sleep. So in this video, we'll be talking about everything new, like the new flashlight, the new processor, the battery life, as well as the new heart rate sensor, along with everything else this has to offer, just to help you decide if this watch is right for you. And what's interesting too is that this watch has actually changed since it first came out with some welcome software updates, including updates surrounding heart rate accuracy, and I'll be showing you results both before and after that update, and if those actually made a difference. Oh, and by the way, you may see some lines or bands on the display on some of these clips, but that's just the refresh rate on the display not matching the frame rate on my camera. You don't see that in real life. The design of the Vertical 2 is pretty familiar to the original, where it still has an industrial look to it with its notches on the bezel, but does bring in some elements of the Race 2, where it's a little bit more refined now with some beveled edges versus the more squared off look of the original. And then for size, so this is basically the same, and this is on the larger end of things where it has a 49mm case and it's around 13.6mm thick. And then the other thing to consider on this watch is the weight, where this is on the heavier side of things, where it's 74 grams for the titanium version and then 87 grams for the stainless steel version. So wearability is something to consider with this watch, and was definitely something I noticed between this and the Race 2. The Race 2 isn't necessarily a small watch by any means, but it is a bit thinner and a little bit lighter, which helps with wearability, especially with sleeves, but also while sleeping, where I definitely noticed the Vertical 2 a little bit more during sleep. But being that this is an outdoor focused sports watch, so well, this thing's built like a tank where it has a sapphire lens and that looks good to go. And then the bezel, so that looks pretty good for the most part, but there's a little bit of wear on some of the edges. Now for the display though, so this is by far the biggest change they made, where they transitioned to using an AMOLED display versus the memory and pixel display from the original. So the reason sports watch manufacturers use memory and pixel displays for so many years is that they're incredibly efficient when it comes to power, but on the flip side, they don't necessarily have that pop that AMOLED displays have when it comes to brightness and colors. However, there's been huge strides with AMOLED displays in recent years to making them more power efficient, and with that, whether we like it or not, this has been the trend of the industry to move over to AMOLED displays, which are basically like our smartphones with these bright, colorful displays. Now, there's an incredibly hot debate when it comes to readability outdoors between these kinds of displays, and while in certain outdoor conditions, memory and pixel displays can be more readable, like in the most direct sunlight, with the current crop of AMOLED displays, there's seriously no issues anymore where these things get crazy bright outside. Like this one in the Vertical 2 has like a peak brightness of 2000 nits, which is ridiculously bright. And again, maybe in the most direct sunlight, memory and pixel can appear better, but I think that's really the only scenario where memory and pixel has a clear advantage. In all other outdoor scenarios, I personally prefer an AMOLED display, especially more like shady or overcast conditions where it can actually be kind of hard to make out a memory and pixel display without the backlight enabled. Using it indoors though is a little bit trickier, where AMOLED is definitely super bright, but there also needs to be some nuance in how the display acts when there's less light, so we're not blinded by the light these can emit. And I'd have to say that this is an area where Suunto I think could put a little bit more work, is automatically lowering the brightness more inside, especially in the evenings where the blue light that these can emit could actually interfere with our circadian rhythms. But putting those nuanced things aside, the display is really good on here, and it's also really big. Like this is 1.5 inches, which is like the size of a small cookie, and being that this is AMOLED, it also has tons of pixels, so there's a lot more detail than what you can get with memory and pixels, and the colors just pop in this thing as well. Now the other side of the display debate comes down to battery life, where in general, memory and pixel uses less power than AMOLED. However, Suunto has some black magic going on inside the Vertical 2, or maybe just a really big battery, because the Vertical 2 gets some fantastic battery life where even while using the always on display, I've been getting weeks out of it before having recharging, even with sleep tracking, with blood oxygen and HRV, and plenty of outdoor activities. And then when it comes to outdoor battery life, so they advertise anywhere from 60 hours all the way up to 250 hours depending on the tracking accuracy. And for my testing, I was basically using the highest accuracy multi-band mode as well as using the always on display, and I almost got that 60-hour figure, but not quite. Pretty darn close though. But even though I didn't quite get that 60-hour mark, these numbers are still very impressive for an AMOLED display. And for comparison, the original Suunto Vertical has about a 60-hour claim as well, and coincidentally, the Enduro 3 from Garmin has around a 60-hour claim too in similar settings. and those have memory and pixel displays. And another thing they improved with the Vertical 2 is the charger, where this has a new magnetic charging cable, which solves an issue with the previous charger where you'd have to have the old charger positioned just right or else it wouldn't charge. With this new charger, you have to try really hard to actually get it wrong, where there's really only one place to charge it. And then the Vertical 2 also gets the new faster processor they brought out with the Race 2, and this addresses probably one of the biggest complaints of the original Vertical, as well as the original Race for that matter, is that the interface was kind of laggy on those originals, but this is kind of a thing of the past now. Now, one thing I was surprised to see Suunto not bring over from the Race series is the rotating dial, where the Vertical 2 shares the same 3-button interface from before. Now, when it comes to dials versus buttons, I'm almost always on the side of buttons, but in this particular case, I prefer the dial, and the reason comes down to the amount of buttons. So with the Vertical 2's 3-button interface, what happens here is that the upper and lower buttons serve mostly as up and down buttons throughout the interface, but there's no dedicated back button. So to go back a screen, you either have to swipe to the right, like you do on Tinder or something like that, or long press the middle button. And with the dial in the Race 2, as well as pretty much every other Suunto watch now, the dial performs the up and down scrolling, which frees up the lower buttons to serve as dedicated back buttons. So using the interface is a little bit more consistent with those watches. Now, when it comes to outdoor scenarios, I definitely can't see the argument where buttons do work better than dials, especially with gloves on, but it's really more about the amount of buttons on the Vertical 2, which only having 3 of them makes this sort of like musical chair sort of thing, depending on what you're doing on the watch. I mean, it's definitely not hard to use by any means, but I do prefer the interface on the Race 2 a little bit better. Now, the other big hardware upgrade on the Vertical 2 is a built-in LED flashlight, and Suunto now joins the ranks of Garmin as well as Amazfit for having dedicated torches on the watch itself. And this is one of those features that once you have it, it's kind of hard to imagine a watch without it. It's just super useful in all sorts of scenarios, and all you have to do to enable it is long press the upper button, which turns it on, and then you can adjust the brightness level, you can turn it to a red mode, there's also an SOS mode, there's a mode that you could use for breath work, and then there's also a flashing alert mode. And this is actually something that changed since it first came out, where with the latest software update, they streamlined the interface where before, when you press the middle button to turn it off, it wouldn't actually immediately go back to the watch face. There was this kind of odd screen here that appeared that had the option to go back or to turn the flashlight back on. Like, just turn it off like I really wanted to and don't show that screen. But thankfully, they did change that to just turn it completely off and go back to the watch face. So for the health feedback on the Vertical 2, so this has all the stuff you'd expect, like tracking your heart rate, it can track your blood oxygen saturation levels, it can track your steps, calories burned, sleep along with sleep stages, and all the standard health metrics. And then beyond that, they also have something called resources, and this basically gives you an indication of how much energy you may have at a given point in time. So if you got a lot of sleep and had more of a recovery day the day before, your resources may likely be higher. And then after a tough workout, your resources may be drained. And speaking of recovery, so it also has a recovery index. So this is all about how well you've recovered from recent training, where it looks at your recent HRV, your recent sleep over the last 7 days, as well as your TSB, or training stress balance, to give you an indication of how well prepared you may be for future training. So this is a bit different than resources, where resources is more about a daily metric about general energy levels, where recovery takes in more factors which relate to how good of a performance you could have on your next workout. And then when it comes to tracking your longer term training trends, so there's many different flavors here. So you can track your training load over time with TSS, or training stress score. So this shows my total training load over the last week, and then you'll be able to dive in further to see more details, like how your longer term chronic training load compares to your shorter term acute training load. And then you also have this progress widget here, and progress is all about how productive you've been with recent training. Like here it shows that I've been training a lot this week compared to the last 42 days, which indicates peak training. But then there's also additional performance related metrics like my running VO2 max, as well as a race time predictor for common running race distances. And while the running VO2 max seems to be pretty in line with my most recent VO2 max tests, as well as some other wearables, the race estimates are pretty aggressive considering my current running volume. Like, I think it'd be kind of a long shot for me to break 20 minutes right now for a 5K, and probably no way of me hitting a 40-minute 10K. So these are a bit ambitious. Now, when it comes to training stress balance, chronic training load, acute training load, and all these other metrics, so these are all standard terms based on training peaks concepts which plenty of athletes as well as coaches use. Now, even though these concepts and terms have been used forever, they aren't necessarily super relatable either, and may be hard to understand if you're not familiar with them. Now, in all fairness, the Vertical 2 is aimed for that ultra endurance athlete who may be familiar with these terms, but I still think there could be some improvement here to make these a little bit more friendly for a wider audience. Now, when it comes to mapping and navigation for outdoor activities, so this is the same as before, where it has offline topo maps that you can use to help give context of your location. So this is where you can see streets, trails, as well as topographical information. One thing to note about these maps though is that these are map images, meaning that you can see where you are on the map, as well as see that there may be like a street, trail, or body of water over there or something, but these aren't fully routable maps, meaning that you're not able to choose a location on the map to route to. However, you can load in routes for navigation, so this is where it can give you guidance during your activity for a predefined route that you'll load onto the watch. And I also like the improvements they made with the elevation, where when you load in a route, it has a really well thought out elevation chart which shows where you're at in regards to the total elevation you have on your route, so you can get an idea of how much suffering you have left for your activity. And one more thing I find impressive here is that the redrawing of the map as well as the responsiveness of the compass is super fast on the vertical too. Actually, it's something I found to be really responsive with other Suunto watches as well, but it's just something I'd mention when it comes to the outdoor navigation experience. Something that's been pretty impressive for me on most Suunto watches is the GPS accuracy for tracking outdoor activities, and I think that continues with the vertical too here, where it's been a solid performer all around, whether that's the total distance collected for road rides, gravel rides, runs in the city, runs in the mountains, rides in the canyon, rides along the coast, you name it, the vertical 2 did a really great job here. And also note that for elevation accuracy, again, something that I found to be really good on Suunto watches, the vertical 2 did a great job here, both compared to a reference source, and in this case that's Strava's corrected elevation figure based off their base maps, but also other devices which are known good devices. Now, when it comes to heart rate accuracy, so this is another thing they brought over from their Race 2 was their latest heart rate sensor, and this is probably the #1 issue I had with the previous Suuntos of the past, where I couldn't necessarily rely on them for reliable heart rate. But not only that, Suunto just made a recent software update which they say significantly improves wrist heart rate accuracy, so I'll have results for you both before this update as well as after, just to see if there's any difference. Alright, so let's start with some indoor cycling. So on this session here, it had some wiggles at the beginning and then a couple of small drops in some of these intervals, but other than that, the vertical 2 did a pretty good job overall. But then on this ride, it was a little bit crazy at the beginning, but after about 10 minutes, it settled in and the rest of the workout was good to go. Okay, so fast forward now to after the recent software update, and I'd say much better, at least on this ride, where there's no warm-up jitters. However, then on this ride, well, I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but I don't necessarily see things like this for indoor cycling, and this was just a nice mellow Z2 session here too, so I'm kind of surprised at these results. Now, taking it outside, so this is where we start to throw some real-world variables into the mix, like bumps and vibrations from the road, which can make a watch bounce around the wrist, regardless of how tight we have it. And this is definitely where we start to see accuracy drift on any watch, and results are going to vary quite a bit depending on the actual type of ride. Like on some rides were quite good, like on this one here. That's actually really great for gravel riding, but then on this ride here, kind of crazy at the beginning. And then on this ride here, again, really good, other than this section right here where it had some drops. Then on these rides here, well, not so good at all. Alright, so after the update though, well, this is kind of weird here, where for the first half of the ride, that's super solid, but then it had some of these sort of like random spikes in the middle, and then these sort of started happening more at the tail end of the ride, so not really sure what was happening there. And what's interesting is that I got much more accurate results out of the Race 2, which has the same heart rate sensor, so with the results on the vertical 2, this just goes back to my theory on how larger and heavier watches can move more on the wrist, which can lead to inaccuracies. But now let's move on to some running, so let's first take a look at this run here, and all in all, it looks fairly close, but what's kind of interesting is that it's kind of linear across the entire run after around 4 minutes all the way up to 25 minutes. It's sort of this straight line versus matching the portion right here where I'm starting to warm up, as well as right here as my heart rate started to increase at the tail end of the run. And this may be an anomaly called cadence lock, where a wrist-based optical heart rate sensor can mistake the rhythm of your footsteps as heart rate. And I think that's probably what happened on these runs here too, where that cadence lock issue was kind of rearing its head, as well as some other drops and dips here or there. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this cadence lock issue. So here's a treadmill run I did with some intervals, and it sort of flatlined a bit right here as well as right here, but it wasn't bad on the intervals themselves for the most part, but it did appear to do that cadence lock thing at the end. But then on this run here, this was actually pretty darn good, although maybe missed the peak on that last interval. Fast forward to a run I did after the update though, well, that's pretty darn good out of the vertical too, where there may be a little bit of shakiness here or here at the beginning, but for the most of the run, it was really good. It didn't quite track the peaks of these couple sprints at the end, but overall, I think that update may have addressed that cadence lock issue. Now, when it comes to weight training and high intensity interval training, so these are basically the hardest kinds of activities for a watch to get right, and it's basically just due to the placement on our wrist, where we're gripping on the dumbbells when we're making like a whole bunch of like wild arm movements. And just like riding outside, results may vary here based on the workout, so it was quite good at least on this workout here, but then on this workout here, not necessarily as good. But then after the software update, well, I have to say that cleaned things up quite a bit, where other than this spot right here, it actually did a really good job in this entire workout, like really good. But when it comes to the things I saw with the gravel riding as well as that steady state indoor ride, well, I'm going to have to loop back to those, and I actually want to go back and retest a whole bunch of other Suunto watches that are getting that same software update to see how they perform. So stay tuned for that video, that'll come in a bit. But I have to say that I'm pretty stoked to see the result from that last run as well as the weight training after the update. So Suunto definitely made some interesting decisions with their latest flagship watch, and it could be good or bad depending on who you are. So the memory pixel versus AMOLED. So this is always a hot topic, and I'm sure this may make some of you hold on to your original vertical, but Suunto was able to still deliver some pretty impressive battery life on the vertical too, and not by just turning a whole bunch of things off to do so. You can still use an always-on display and have a bright display at that, and still have very respectable battery life out of it, even while tracking tons of outdoor activities. And in terms of visibility, again, there's really no debate here anymore when it comes to how bright these AMOLED displays can get, and this one is crazy bright. And of course the add of the flashlight, which is simply awesome. I think the only missing piece for me is the dial on the Race 2, which I think really helps usability quite a bit versus having the limitation of the 3-button interface here. But is this still flagship though? Absolutely. It delivers flagship features, a flagship build, as well as flagship battery life, all with a competitive price tag. Anyhow, those are my thoughts on the Vertical 2, but definitely let us all know what you think as well down in the comment section, and also be on the lookout for plenty more sports tech videos just like this that are coming up soon. In the meantime, have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.